Throwaway account for obvious reasons. I'd been sitting on this story for years, telling myself I'd take it to the grave, but lately it's been eating at me in a way I can't ignore anymore. I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm not even sure I deserve understanding. I just need to say it somewhere, to someone who doesn't know my family, doesn't have to look my brother in the eye at Thanksgiving. This is the story of how I stole from my own brother and burned a relationship I can't rebuild. Growing up, my brother was the responsible one. Older by 3 years, steady job straight out of college, good with money, good with people. I was the opposite, drifting, half-finished plans, always convinced I was one good break away from getting my life together. We were close as kids, but adulthood put a quiet distance between us. Not hostile. Just different trajectories. By the time this happened, I was in a bad place financially. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth. I was buried under credit card debt, behind on rent, and juggling lies just to keep people from asking questions. Every night felt like doing math in my head that never added up. I was scared, embarrassed, and deeply resentful of how easily my brother seemed to move through life. The money wasn't sitting in a vault or anything dramatic like that. It was family money. Inherited, partially managed by him because he was good with details. That's what everyone said. Including me. I trusted him. He trusted me more than he should have. What makes this worse is that I didn't wake up one day and impulsively do it. This wasn't a drunken mistake or a heat-of-the-moment decision. The thought crept in slowly, almost politely. It's temporary. I'll pay it back. He won't even notice. Each version of the thought felt reasonable when I first let it sit in my head. I told myself I was borrowing, not stealing. I told myself family helps family. I told myself I deserved a break for once. Looking back, it's obvious how carefully I framed the lie so I could live with myself. At the time, though, it felt like survival. I didn't think about what would happen if things went wrong. I didn't think about how money isn't just money when it's tied to trust. I definitely didn't think about how this one decision would become the loudest thing in the room every time my brother and I were together after that. This is where it starts. Once the idea took root, it didn't leave me alone. It followed me through my day like background noise. At work. In the shower. Lying awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling and counting bills instead of sheep. I kept telling myself I was just thinking, but thinking slowly turned into rehearsing. I started paying closer attention to how things worked in my family. Who handled what? Who asked questions and who didn't? I'd always tuned that stuff out before because it bored me. Suddenly, I was noticing details I'd ignored for years. Dates. Patterns. The way my brother talked about money like it was a spreadsheet, not something emotional. That's when I convinced myself he wouldn't feel it the way I would. I didn't sit down and write a plan like a movie villain or anything. It was messier than that. It was a series of small mental adjustments, each one making the next step feel less extreme. First I told myself I'd just check something. Then I told myself I was just moving money temporarily. Each thought softened the next decision. What scares me now is how calm I felt during this phase. Not panicked. Not desperate. Focused. I remember feeling oddly capable, like I was finally solving a problem instead of running from it. That feeling alone should have been a warning sign. I also spent a lot of time justifying it to myself in advance, like I was prepping for a trial that hadn't happened yet. I imagined conversations that never occurred. I practiced explanations no one asked for. If he ever finds out, I'll explain. If something goes wrong, I'll fix it. I was building a safety net out of words. There were moments I almost backed out. Little flashes of clarity when I'd think, this is your brother. Don't do this. But then I'd look at my bank balance, or get another late notice, and the fear would roar back louder than my conscience. I didn't think of it as crossing a line. I thought of it as stepping over something small, something I could step back from later. That was the biggest lie I told myself during the preparation phase, that there was an easy way back. By the time I was ready, it no longer felt like a choice. It felt like momentum. The day I actually did it didn't feel dramatic. That's something I still wrestle with. I always thought crossing a moral line would come with some kind of internal alarm, a voice screaming stop. Instead, it felt like running an errand I didn't want to think too hard about. I remember the exact time because I checked the clock twice, like it mattered. Late morning. Sunlight coming through the window. Normal day. That normalcy made it worse somehow. The world wasn't reacting to what I was about to do, so my brain took that as permission. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I wasn't shaking or sweating. If anything, I felt hyper-aware, every click, every pause, every second stretching just a little longer than usual. I kept expecting something to interrupt me. A phone call. A text from my brother. Some cosmic sign. Nothing came. The rationalizations were still running in the background, like a script I'd memorized. You're just moving it. This is temporary. You'll fix this before anyone notices. Saying it over and over dulled the reality of what my fingers were actually doing. There was a moment, just a split second, where I hovered frozen. That was the last exit ramp. I knew it too. I remember thinking, once this happens, you can unknow it. And instead of stopping, I pushed through that thought like it was an inconvenience. When it was done, I didn't feel relief the way I expected. I felt exposed. Like I'd stepped out into the open without realizing how empty the space was. The money was there now, technically in my control, but it didn't feel like mine. It felt radioactive. I closed everything, cleaned up, erased what I thought needed erasing. I stood up and walked around my apartment just to prove to myself I could still move, still breathe. Nothing had exploded. No sirens. No immediate consequences. That's when the adrenaline hit, not a rush of excitement, but a cold awareness that I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I kept telling myself I'd feel better once I used the money for what I needed. Instead, all I could think was, you've done something you can't take back. The first few days after were the strangest. On paper, things were better. Bills got paid. The immediate pressure eased. I could breathe again, at least financially. But mentally, it was like I'd invited a stranger into my head, and they refused to leave. Every notification on my phone made my stomach drop. I'd see my brother's name pop up and feel my heart slam into my ribs, even if the message was just a meme or a random question. I started reading tone into everything he said, looking for suspicion where there probably wasn't any. A simple, "Hey, how've you been?" felt loaded, like an interrogation disguised as politeness. I also became weirdly obsessed with tracking time. Days since. Weeks since. I told myself that if enough time passed without anyone noticing, it would somehow mean I was in the clear. Like there was an invisible statute of limitations on guilt. But the longer it went unnoticed, the heavier it felt. Silence wasn't relief, it was pressure. I avoided family gatherings more than usual. When I did show up, I felt like I was acting in a play where everyone else had the script except me. I laughed at the right moments, nodded at the right cues, all while carrying this secret that made every interaction feel fake. I remember sitting across from my brother at dinner, watching him talk about work, and thinking, if you knew, you'd never look at me the same. At night, the justifications started to crack. I'd replay what I did in my head, but now the language was changing. It was harder to call it borrowing. Harder to pretend it was harmless. The word stolen crept in when I wasn't paying attention, and once it showed up, it refused to leave. I told myself I'd pay it back soon. That this was just a rough chapter, not the whole story. But soon kept moving further away, and every day I didn't fix it made the idea of fixing it feel more impossible. That's when I realized something important and terrifying. The crime wasn't just what I did that day. It was the choice to keep living like nothing had happened. The first crack came from something stupid. Not an audit, not a confrontation, not karma swooping in dramatically. Just a casual question. My brother called me one afternoon, while I was out, asked if I remembered a conversation we'd had months earlier about moving some money around. His tone was neutral, almost bored. But my brain lit up like a crime scene. I replayed every word he said, searching for hidden meaning. My mouth went dry. I lied without thinking. That's the part that still scares me, the speed of it. No pause. No struggle. Just a smooth, practiced-sounding answer that slid right out of me like I'd been rehearsing for weeks. Maybe I had been. He didn't challenge it. Just said, "Okay," and moved on to another topic. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something snap inside me. That lie made everything heavier. Before, it was just a secret. Now it was a structure, and I'd added another beam to hold it up. After that, I became hypervigilant. I checked things I had no reason to check. I read between lines that weren't there. I convinced myself every family conversation was circling closer to the truth. When someone mentioned finances, even jokingly, I felt heat rush to my face like I'd been called out. I also started rewriting the story in my head. Not just for others, but for myself. I'd catch myself thinking, he's fine. He doesn't need it. Or worse, he'd understand if he knew how bad things were. Those thoughts didn't make me feel better. They made me feel smaller. What I didn't expect was how lonely it would feel. Not the obvious kind of loneliness where you're physically alone, but the kind where you're surrounded by people who love you and you know, deep down, that love is now conditional on a lie. Every interaction had an expiration date attached to it, even if I didn't know when it would hit. I started drinking more around this time. Not enough for anyone to comment on, but enough to quiet the noise at night. It worked briefly. Then the guilt would show up louder the next morning, like it resented being ignored. That's when I realized the situation was no longer under my control. I wasn't managing the lie anymore. The lie was managing me. There was a moment where I still could have stopped everything. I don't mean undo it. What was done, but I could have confessed. I could have come clean, faced whatever fallout came with it, and at least kept some shred of honesty intact. I know that now. Back then, I treated that option like it was off the table entirely. The moment came during a family get-together. Nothing formal, just one of those low-key weekends where everyone ends up in the same room, half watching TV, half arguing about food. My brother and I ended up alone in the kitchen, both of us reaching for drinks at the same time. It was mundane. That's why it stuck with me. He mentioned stress at work, how he felt like he was carrying more responsibility lately. He laughed it off, but I could hear the tiredness underneath. Then he said something that punched the air out of my lungs. "Sometimes I feel like everyone assumes I've got everything handled." He didn't mean it the way I took it. I know that. But standing there, listening to him talk about being relied on, trusted, I felt like a fraud wearing my own face. I almost told him. I swear I did. I opened my mouth, felt the words lining up, and then panic slammed the door shut. Instead, I nodded. Gave some generic supportive response. Maybe even joked a little. I hate that part. I hate how normal I sounded. That night, I lay awake replaying that conversation on a loop. My brain did this cruel thing where it showed me two futures side by side. In one, I told the truth and everything blew up immediately: anger, disappointment, fallout. In the other, I stayed quiet and things stayed fine. I chose the second one because it felt safer, even though it was rotting from the inside. That choice changed something in me. Before, I told myself I was just buying time. After that night, I think I knew I was running from consequences instead. There's a difference, even if it's subtle. I started to feel detached from my own life, like I was watching myself make decisions I didn't respect but couldn't stop. Every time I thought about confessing after that, it felt harder, not easier. Like the truth was getting heavier the longer I carried it. That was the turning point. Not because something happened, but because something didn't. The thing about telling yourself you'll pay it back Is that eventually reality asks for a timeline? At first, I really believed I'd fix it. I picked up extra hours, cut back where I could, even sold a few things. I tracked numbers obsessively, convincing myself progress was being made. But life has a way of not pausing just because you're trying to clean up a mess. Unexpected expenses popped up. Work got shaky. The gap between what I owed and what I could realistically replace stopped shrinking and started mocking me. That's when the anxiety shifted into something darker. I stopped thinking in terms of repayment and started thinking in terms of avoidance. How long could this go unnoticed? What questions might come up next? What answers would I need ready? I hated that part of myself, the part that was now planning around secrecy instead of solutions, but I also felt trapped by it. My brother mentioned the money again, casually, in a group setting. Not accusing. Just referencing future plans, assumptions built on numbers I knew were no longer accurate. I smiled and nodded along while my chest tightened. It felt like watching someone build a house on ground I'd quietly hollowed out underneath them. After that, I started preemptively justifying things in my head. He's better off than me. This won't ruin him. Families survive worse than this. Each thought felt flimsy, but I stacked them anyway, like sandbags against a flood I knew was coming. Sleep got worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I'd missed something obvious. Some email. Some statement. Some sign I was about to be exposed. I checked my phone constantly, even when there was nothing new to check. The worst part wasn't fear anymore. It was the slow realization that I'd backed myself into a corner where every option hurt. Paying it back felt impossible. Confessing felt catastrophic. Staying silent felt cruel. That's when I started to understand that the damage wasn't waiting in the future. It was already happening. The confrontation didn't come the way I'd imagined it 100 times. No shouting. No dramatic reveal. Just a question, asked quietly, that landed harder than anything else could have. My brother called and asked if we could talk one-on-one. Even before he said why, I knew. There's a tone people get when they've already connected dots but are still hoping they're wrong. I heard it immediately, and my body reacted before my brain did. Tight chest, buzzing ears, that hollow feeling like an elevator dropping too fast. We met up in person. Neutral place. Public enough to keep things calm, private enough to talk. I remember noticing stupid details, the way he stirred his drink, how tired he looked. It made me want to rewind time more than anything else ever has. He didn't accuse me outright. He laid out what he noticed. Numbers that didn't line up. Assumptions he'd double-checked. He said, "I just need to know if I'm missing something." That was it. An opening. A lifeline, really? I lied again. I didn't even commit fully to it. I hedged. I danced. I offered explanations that sounded reasonable but thin. I could see him listening, weighing my words, wanting to believe me because believing me was easier than the alternative. That might be the part one regret the most, making him work to trust me when I already knew I didn't deserve it. There was a long pause after I finished talking. He didn't yell. He didn't interrupt. He just looked at me in a way I'd never seen before. Not angry. Not confused. Disappointed in a quiet, settled way. He said, "Okay." But it didn't sound like agreement. It sounded like resignation. We parted politely. Too politely. I walked away knowing I hadn't solved anything. I just delayed the inevitable and somehow made it worse. The adrenaline wore off fast, leaving behind a heavy, nauseating guilt that sat in my stomach for days. That was the moment I understood something brutal. Even before the truth came out, the trust was already bleeding out. It didn't take long after that meeting for everything to collapse. I think my brother needed time, not to build a case, but to accept what he already knew. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. No casual texts. No memes. Just absence. Then came the call. He didn't ease into it this time. He told me he'd gone back through everything. cross-checked dates, reconstructed timelines. He said my explanations didn't hold up. His voice wasn't raised, but it was firm in a way that left no room to maneuver. I remember staring at the wall while he talked, watching a crack in the paint like it might offer an escape hatch. He asked me directly. I tried to answer and couldn't. My throat closed up, and for a second I thought I might actually throw up. All the words I'd practiced over months evaporated. What finally came out wasn't a speech or a justification. It was just, yeah. That single word felt heavier than everything I'd stolen. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Not the awkward kind. The kind where something permanent is being decided. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different, flatter, like he'd set something down carefully and stepped away from it. He asked how much? I told him. He asked how long? I told him that too. Every answer felt like another small cut, precise and unavoidable. I could hear his breathing change, like he was trying to keep himself steady. He didn't call me names. He didn't threaten me. Somehow, that made it worse. He said, "I trusted you." And stopped there, like anything more would be unnecessary. After we hung up, I sat on my floor for a long time. Not crying. Just staring. The adrenaline was gone, the fear was gone, and all that was left was the damage, clear, undeniable, and fully mine. That was the moment it stopped being a secret I carried and became a reality I had to live with. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It spread. My brother told the rest of the family. Not dramatically, not with embellishment. Just the facts. I found out because people stopped calling me the same way. Conversations changed tone. Pauses got longer. Words got more careful. It was like everyone suddenly agreed on an unspoken rule about me. A few family members reached out privately. Some were angry. Some were disappointed. Some tried to be understanding in that strained way that actually hurts more. I answered every message, took every call, apologized until the words felt thin and overused. Nothing I said made anything better. It just filled space. My brother cut contact completely for a while. No texts. No calls. No updates through other people. That silence was worse than any confrontation could have been. I realized I'd always assumed we'd eventually talk things through, because that's what family does. Watching that assumption crumble forced me to see how fragile it actually was. There were practical consequences too. Repayment plans. Awkward discussions involving numbers that now had emotional weight attached to them. Every dollar I paid back felt both necessary and meaningless. Necessary because it was the right thing to do. Meaningless because it didn't undo the breach. I started questioning how people saw me, and how much of that perception was earned. I'd always thought of myself as flawed but fundamentally decent. Now I had to sit with the fact that I'd done something calculated and selfish to someone who trusted me implicitly. The shame was constant, but it wasn't loud. It was quiet and persistent, like a low-grade hum that followed me everywhere. At work. In social situations. Alone at night. I became hyper-aware of my own capacity to rationalize bad behavior, and that scared me more than being judged. I kept hoping for some sign that things could go back to normal. Not immediately. Just, eventually. But deep down, I knew normal was gone. Whatever replaced it would be something thinner, more cautious, if it existed at all. That's when the full weight of what I'd destroyed finally settled in. After the initial fallout, life didn't pause to let me process anything. It just kept moving, dragging me along behind it. Bills still needed paying. Work still expected results. People still asked, "How've you been?" Like it was a neutral question. I focused on repayment because it was the only concrete thing I could do. I set up a plan, stuck to it obsessively, sometimes at the expense of everything else. No nights out. No small comforts. I treated every payment like proof that I wasn't completely irredeemable. But each transfer also felt like a reminder of why it was necessary in the first place. I reached out to my brother a few times. Carefully worded messages. No pressure. No excuses. Just acknowledgments of harm and updates on repayment. Most of them went unanswered. A couple got short, factual replies. Nothing emotional. Nothing personal. It felt like corresponding with someone who used to know me but didn't anymore. What surprised me was how much I missed the ordinary stuff. The inside jokes. The effortless trust. The way we used to talk without every word feeling like it might carry weight. Losing that made the crime feel bigger than the money ever was. I also started noticing how this changed my relationship with myself. I didn't trust my own reasoning anymore. Any time I felt justified or wronged or tempted to cut corners, alarms went off in my head. This is how it starts. That hyper-awareness was exhausting, but I didn't feel entitled to peace yet. Friends who knew the full story treated me differently too. Some distanced themselves quietly. Others stayed but watched me more closely, like they were waiting to see who I'd be next. I couldn't blame them. I was doing the same thing internally. Rebuilding wasn't a straight line. Some days I felt like I was making progress, like maybe this would become a scar instead of an open wound. Other days, the guilt felt just as raw as it did the moment I said yeah on the phone. What I was slowly learning was that consequences aren't always about punishment. Sometimes they're about loss, and there's no shortcut through that. Time did what it always does, it passed, whether I felt ready for it or not. Months went by. Repayments continued. The sharpest edges of the situation dulled, but they didn't disappear. The family learned how to exist around the fracture without constantly touching it. My name came up less. When it did, it was careful, like people were testing a sore tooth with their tongue. My brother eventually broke the silence. Not with forgiveness, not with anger, just contact. A short message about logistics. Necessary, neutral, emotionally empty. I stared at it for a long time before replying, afraid of reading too much or too little into it. That's what our relationship had become, an exercise in restraint. When we finally saw each other in person again, it was surreal. We were polite. Civil, almost professional. It felt like meeting a former coworker instead of the person who knew me better than almost anyone. There was no big conversation, no airing of feelings. Just surface-level interaction and a shared understanding of what we were not going to talk about. Part of me wanted to push for resolution, for some clear statement of where we stood. Another part of me knew I hadn't earned that clarity. Forgiveness isn't something you can request on a schedule. And even if it comes, it doesn't erase consequences. I realized then that I'd been waiting for a moment where the guilt would officially be over. Like there would be a checkpoint where I'd paid enough, apologized enough, suffered enough. But that moment never arrived. Instead, the guilt just integrated itself into my life, less intense, but always present. That was hard to accept. Not because I wanted to feel bad forever, but because it meant this wasn't a chapter that would neatly close. It was a footnote on every interaction going forward, even the good ones. I started to understand that accountability isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's repetitive. It's choosing not to look away from what you did, even when no one else is watching anymore. And that might be the hardest part of all. At some point, the story stopped being about the money and started being about identity. I'd always thought of myself as someone who made mistakes, not someone who was one. This experience messed with that distinction. I had to confront the fact that I was capable of betraying someone I loved, not in a moment of rage or desperation, but through sustained, rationalized choices. That realization didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, settling into places I hadn't checked before. I started paying attention to how I made decisions, even small ones. How quickly I looked for shortcuts. How easily I framed things in my favor. It wasn't that I suddenly became a better person overnight. I didn't trust that kind of transformation, but I became more cautious with my own narratives. Any time I caught myself saying, "I deserve this or it won't hurt anyone," I stopped and interrogated it. Therapy helped. Not in a magical way, but in a structured, uncomfortable way. Saying the story out loud to someone who wasn't emotionally invested forced me to hear it without the protective filters I'd built. There were sessions where I left feeling worse than when I walked in, but clearer. I needed that clarity, even when it stung. I also learned that shame and responsibility aren't the same thing. Shame makes you want to disappear. Responsibility makes you show up anyway. For a long time, I'd confused the two and leaned into shame because it felt like punishment. Letting go of that, without letting myself off the hook, was harder than I expected. I don't think my brother sees me the same way anymore. I know that. Some days I can live with it. Other days it hits me out of nowhere, like grief for a version of myself that doesn't exist anymore. But pretending I'm unchanged would be another lie, and I've had enough of those for one lifetime. What this did, more than anything, was strip away the illusion that my intentions mattered more than my actions. They don't. Not even close. And once you really understand that, you can unlearn it. Even now, years later, there are moments when it sneaks up on me. A holiday where seating arrangements are slightly off. A group chat where my brother responds with a thumbs up instead of words. A story someone tells about trust or betrayal that makes the room feel smaller than it is. Nothing dramatic. Just quiet reminders that some things don't go back to the way they were, no matter how much time you give them. We function now. That's the best word for it. We can be in the same space. We can talk about neutral things. We can even laugh occasionally. But there's a boundary I didn't put there and can't remove. I feel it every time I consider sharing something personal and decide not to. I see it in how carefully he keeps certain parts of his life separate from me. What hurts isn't just that he doesn't fully trust me anymore. It's that he's right not to. I've had to grieve that loss privately, because it's not a loss I'm entitled to be loud about. I caused it. That's a strange kind of grief, one where you're both the mourner and the reason for the funeral. There's no one to blame but yourself, and no one who can fix it for you. Sometimes I think about how small the decision felt at the start. How reasonable it sounded in my own head. How easily I talked myself into believing I was still a good person doing a bad thing. Temporarily. That thought scares me more now than it ever did then, because it means the danger wasn't desperation. It was familiarity. Comfort. Ego. If there's a scar here, it's not just in my relationship with my brother. It's in how I understand myself. I don't get to assume my own integrity anymore. I have to practice it, consciously, repeatedly. That's exhausting, but it's also grounding. It keeps me honest in ways I wasn't before. Some relationships break loudly. Ours broke quietly, and we've been living in the echo ever since. And that's something I'll carry for the rest of my life. If you'd asked me back then whether I'd ever steal from my own family, I would have said no without hesitation. I would have meant it. That's the part one wants people to understand, the line between the kind of person who does this and the kind of person who doesn't is thinner than we like to believe. I didn't wake up evil. I didn't plan to destroy a relationship. I made a series of choices that prioritized my fear and pride over honesty, and by the time I understood what those choices added up to, the damage was already done. If you're reading this and you're in a situation where you're justifying something you know is wrong, especially with family, please stop earlier than I did. Tell the truth while it's still a single moment of pain instead of a long, drawn-out erosion of trust. Secrets don't stay contained. They spread. They change how you move through the world. Money problems feel urgent and overwhelming, but they're almost always solvable in ways that don't cost you the people who matter most. I learned that too late. No amount of temporary relief was worth the permanent shift in how my brother sees me. As for me, I live with what I did. I repay what I owe. I show up where I can. I don't ask for forgiveness I haven't earned, and I don't expect things to ever fully reset. That's part of the consequence. If there's any advice I can give, it's this: don't trust the voice that tells you you'll fix it later. Later is where the real damage happens.